Neil could think of only one thing that would make him give thanks to God, and that was if he allowed Sarah to appear before him. It would give him immeasurable comfort just to see her smile again. He had never been visited by a saved soul before, and the vision now would have meant more to him than at any other point in his life. But visions don't appear just because a person needs one, and none ever came to Neil. He had to find his own way toward God. The next time he attended the support group meeting for witnesses of Nathaniel's visitation, Neil sought out Benny Vasquez, the man whose eyes had been erased by heaven's light. Benny didn't always attend because he was now being invited to speak at other meetings. Few visitations resulted in an eyeless person, since heaven's light entered the mortal plane only in the brief moments that an angel emerged from or re-entered heaven, so the eyeless were minor celebrities and in demand as speakers to church groups. Benny was now as sightless as any burrowing worm. Not only were his eyes and sockets missing, his skull lacked even the space for such features, the cheekbones now abutting the forehead. The light that had brought his soul as close to perfection as was possible in the mortal plane had also deformed his body. It was commonly held that this illustrated the superfluity of physical bodies in heaven. With the limited expressive capacity his face retained, Benny always wore a blissful, rapturous smile. Neil hoped Benny could say something to help him love God. Benny described heaven's light as infinitely beautiful, a sight of such compelling majesty that it vanquished all doubts. It constituted incontrovertible proof that God should be loved, an explanation that made it as obvious as 1 + 1 = 2. Unfortunately, while Benny could offer many analogies for the effect of heaven's light, he couldn't duplicate that effect with his own words. Those who were already devout found Benny's descriptions thrilling, but to Neil they seemed frustratingly vague, so he looked elsewhere for counsel. "Accept the mystery," said the minister of the local church. "If you can love God even though your questions go unanswered, you'll be the better for it." "Admit that you need Him," said the popular book of spiritual advice he bought. "When you realize that self-sufficiency is an illusion, you'll be ready." "Submit yourself completely and utterly," said the preacher on the television. "Receiving torment is how you prove your love. Acceptance may not bring you relief in this life, but resistance will only worsen your punishment." All of these strategies have proven successful for different individuals. Any one of them, once internalized, can bring a person to devotion. But these are not always easy to adopt, and Neil was one who found them impossible. Neil finally tried talking to Sarah's parents, which was an indication of how desperate he was. His relationship with them had always been tense. While they loved Sarah, they often chided her for not being demonstrative enough in her devotion, and they'd be shocked when she married a man who wasn't devout at all. For her part, Sarah had always considered her parents too judgmental, and their disapproval of Neil only reinforced her opinion. But now Neil felt he had something in common with them. After all, they were all mourning Sarah's loss, and so he visited them in their suburban colonial, hoping they could help him in his grief. How wrong he was. Instead of sympathy, what Neil got from Sarah's parents was blame for her death. They'd come to this conclusion in the weeks after Sarah's funeral. They reasoned that she'd been taken to send him a message, and that they were forced to endure her loss solely because he hadn't been devout. They were now convinced that, his previous explanations notwithstanding, Neil's deformed leg was in fact God's doing, and if only he'd been properly chastened by it. Sarah might still be alive. Their reaction shouldn't have come as a surprise. Throughout Neil's life, people had attributed moral significance to his leg even though God wasn't responsible for it. Now that he'd suffered a misfortune for which God was unambiguously responsible, it was inevitable that someone would assume he deserved it. It was purely by chance that Neil heard this sentiment when he was at his most vulnerable, and it could have the greatest impact on him. Neil didn't think his in-laws were right, but he began to wonder if he might not be better off if he did. Perhaps, he thought, it'd be better to live in a story where the righteous were rewarded and the sinners were punished, even if the criteria for righteousness and sinfulness eluded him, than to live in a reality where there was no justice at all. It would mean casting himself in the role of sinner, so it was hardly a comforting lie, but it offered one reward that his own ethics couldn't: believing it would reunite him with Sarah. Sometimes even bad advice can point a man in the right direction. It was in this manner that his in-laws' accusations ultimately pushed Neil closer to God. More than once, when she was evangelizing, Janice had been asked if she ever wished she had legs, and she had always answered honestly, no, she didn't. She was content as she was. Sometimes her questioner would point out that she couldn't miss what she'd never known, and she might feel differently if she'd been born with legs and lost them later on. Janice never denied that, but she could truthfully say that she felt no sense of being incomplete, no envy for people with legs. Being legless was part of her identity. She had never bothered with prosthetics, and had a surgical procedure been available to provide her with legs, she'd have turned it down. She had never considered the possibility that God might restore her legs. One of the unexpected side effects of having legs was the increased attention she received from men. In the past, she'd mostly attracted men with amputee fetishes or sainthood complexes. Now, all sorts of men seemed drawn to her. So when she first noticed Ethan Meade's interest in her, she thought it was romantic in nature. This possibility was particularly distressing since he was obviously married. Ethan had begun talking to Janice at the support group meetings, and then began attending her public speaking engagements. It was when he suggested they have lunch together that Janice asked him about his intentions, and he explained his theory. He didn't know his fate was intertwined with hers. He knew only that it was. She was skeptical, but she didn't reject his theory outright. Ethan admitted that he didn't have answers for her own questions, but he was eager to do anything he could help her find them. Janice cautiously agreed to help him in his research for meaning, and Ethan promised that he wouldn't be a burden. They met on a regular basis and talked about the significance of visitations. Meanwhile, Ethan's wife, Claire, grew worried. Ethan assured her that he had no romantic feelings toward Janice, but that didn't alleviate her concerns. She knew that extreme circumstances could create a bond between individuals, and she feared that Ethan's relationship with Janice, romantic or not, would threaten their marriage. Ethan suggested to Janice that he, as a librarian, could help her do some research. Neither of them had ever heard of a previous instance where God had left his mark on a person in one visitation and removed it in another. Ethan looked for previous examples in hopes that they might shed some light on Janice's situation. There were a few instances of individuals receiving multiple miracle cures over their lifetimes, but their illnesses or disabilities had always been of natural origin, not given to them in a visitation. There was one anecdotal report of a man being struck blind for his sins, changing his ways, and later having his sight restored, but it was classified as an urban legend. Even if that account had a basis in truth, it didn't provide a useful precedent for Janice's situation. Her legs had been removed before her birth, so it couldn't have been a punishment for anything she'd done. Was it possible that Janice's condition had been a punishment for something her mother or father had done? Could her restoration mean they had finally earned her cure? She couldn't believe that.